Okay, I think it's finally time that we talk about the Sydney Swans because they have gone from a grand finalist last year, who were the hottest team going into that final series, to getting absolutely walloped in the grand final by the Brisbane Lions, to this season becoming one of the red-hot favourites to win the Premiership. They thought they were going to get better, and suddenly they have found themselves just going down, down and down, until recently where we're seeing a slight uptick in their form, and I want to explain all of it. So the Swans changed their coach. Dean Cox comes in and says, we have to change our defensive profile because if we don't, we're just going to have the same season. What have they changed from the start of the season to how they're playing now, or what does that actually look like? Let's have a squiz. The first major strength that we know Sydney have is their ball use. It's their kicking. So when they get the football in this situation off their half-back line, we're so used to seeing them take the ball through the corridor with chip kicks, with those really accurate slicing, dicing left footers that they have all throughout this team. The issue is we would usually see them hit this kick right here, or we'd usually see a Braden Campbell come here and we would take this kick on into the middle of the ground. But at the start of this season, when they were really struggling, they weren't doing that and they were kicking long up the line, long up the line, long up the line. Now that doesn't work when you don't have talented forwards. In this situation, you're lucky that you do have a talented forward in Isaac Heaney playing up the ground here. But again, we're going to see the exact same problem because in this situation right now, when Isaac Heaney gets his forward handball to Chad Warner, he is absolutely off and running. Look at the space he has in front of him to work with. And last year, this is where Sydney was so dangerous. Chad Warner would take this ball straight through the Melbourne defence and hit up a leading forward, which actually papered over a lot of the cracks. But this year, this is the sort of ball use that we're seeing. And obviously, we can't go through every single kick that Chad Warner or Isaac Heaney or any of their players have had. But that is the general trend that we've seen. For the early part of this season, we have seen them be unable to punish teams offensively. And again, in the same game, we've got Matty Roberts here in basically the same situation that we just saw before, but he does take on this inside kick, and this is where we saw Sydney be so good. And when they're at their best, this is where they're so good. Again, in this situation, it's Chad Warner. How often did we see him last year? We see players like him, Isaac Heaney, Errol Gordon stream through the middle of the ground and then deliver to their forwards inside 50 on the lead. But it's not just about the skill execution here where he misses the kick. It's actually the option as well. So you're kicking to a 2v1 here where your one player, James Jordan, is against Max Gawn and Jake Bowie out the back. It's the decision making and the ball use put together. And they just kept turning the football over, turning the football over, turning the football over. Early in the season, when you take away one of Sydney's biggest strengths, which was their kicking, which was their ball use, they are unable to punish you like they were last year. We all recognise how good Sydney were last year kicking the football, especially off turnover, because that's where they could get their runners involved. That's where they could get their line breakers involved. So here's two of your line breakers. Heaney out to Warner again, and I promise I'm not picking on Warner, I promise, but these are just the easiest examples to show, because this kick, this high ball, we don't see that from Sydney last year. We saw Warner and we saw Heaney and we saw Gooden break through those lines. We saw Blakey break through those lines and really get those darts going inside forward 50, because Sydney don't have the forwards that can compete with those sort of high balls. And again, we're going to see another forward 50 kick. This is where we usually see Sydney dissect you going inside forward 50. So you've just missed one. Now you're about to miss a second kick. Again, this is a high ball that's not going to work. You're just allowing your opposition to get into position to make a play on the football. That is what we didn't see from Sydney last year. We saw last year that Sydney, every time they got the football, they looked like they were going to score because they weren't making decisions like that. They were kicking the ball and disposing of the ball into really hard to defend areas to the advantage of their forwards, to the advantage of their midfielders. And at the start of this year, we completely lost that. But the real kicker is that when you make decisions like that, it exposes your defense so much more because you're turning the football over, and often turning the football over in poor situations, in poor positions on the ground, which we see so often this year. And then at the start of this year, they just weren't able to compete. They just defensively were not able to compete. So look at how easy Gold Coast transitioned this football unopposed, untouched from D50 to forward 50 to a shot on goal. This was the biggest issue last year, and this was the biggest issue that they had early this year. Is anytime a team was able to get control of the football like Gold Coast were able to here, they just couldn't put enough defensive pressure, enough defensive just competition on the football to be able to stop teams from scoring pretty much at will. It wasn't just a lack of ability to compete in the air, it was a lack of ability to compete at the stoppage around the ground, which we've usually seen Sydney be so good at. So I just want us to look at this stoppage and look at how easy the Gold Coast Suns are able to exit this stoppage. Look, so firstly, out the back of this stoppage, no pressure on the quarterback roll here for the Gold Coast Suns, but then it's basically one. So that's a loopy handball from a Gold Coast player. But look at how slow Sydney are to put pressure on, to the point where this 1-on-3 instantly becomes a 2-on-1 over here. And look, you've got players like Brodie Grundy, you've got players like James Jordan who are just 3-4 steps behind, not able to put any pressure on. So Dan Rioli just runs straight out the front of this stoppage right now, and you get an uncontested mark inside forward 50. So if offensively you're going to struggle and not be able to use the ball as well as you were last year, and then defensively you're not able to compete either in the air or at ground level around the stoppage, you are opening yourself up to getting smashed week in, week out. And that's basically what we saw from the Swans at the start of this year. It's what we saw in the grand final against the Brisbane Lions. So how are they turning that around? Well, let's have a look at what they're starting to do well. And let's be absolutely clear, it's only been about 3, maybe 4 weeks, and they've started to get some players back, which definitely helps in this situation. But it's these sort of things that they're starting to change. So firstly, we're going to see Brodie Grundy take an intercept mark. Now, he just goes off, and usually we see in a situation like this a just dump kick because you're full of adrenaline, you're running forward in the football, you're running into a contest. But instead, look at the decision-making that Brodie Grundy does here to get this handball off. But it's not just the handball over here. It's also the next handball in the run through. And then it's one more handball again. So 3 plays here have not blazed away going inside forward 50. And you go to Lewis Malikan on the outside, who's not necessarily a noted kicker, but you've given him enough time and enough space to make a good decision. And now he can go inside forward 50. Now, you drop the mark here, but that's great ball use, and that is great decision-making. And it realistically should have you 45 metres out directly in front thanks to a chest mark. And then if we want to talk about what Sydney has changed, this is probably one of the first times that we've seen this sort of play from Sydney. Now, it's a play that we basically saw almost every single game last year, but this is what they're starting to do now. This is what they're starting to get back into the game. It feels like they're trusting themselves to do this more often. We get a stop play right here. And again, instead of going long up the line, which we've seen them do so often at the start of this season, we're taking on the inboard kick. But we're not just taking on the inboard kick, we're seeing the next inboard kick. And then it's the follow-up run from your overlap players, your players like Gordon, your players like Blakey, which we haven't seen so far this season. And again, it's the decision-making to not blast it long in that situation and instead hit up the person in the middle of the ground who can take a second, make a good decision with the football. And now instead of turning the football over in the middle of the ground where you cannot defend, you're actually kicking to contest deep inside your defensive forward 50, where you can get pressure on the football, where your skilled players, where your players like Warner and Papley and Heaney can start to take over the game. And now you're getting really good shots on goal. And that all comes down to your ability to use the ball well, but also your ability to make good decisions with ball in hand. So at the start of the season, we've gone from really poor ball use and poor decision-making, oftentimes, to really good decision-making, really good ball use, back to the ball use that we saw last year. But there's even more changes that we've seen already. And just a couple of minutes ago, we saw how easily Sydney just let Gold Coast waltz out of stoppage. And that was a real common occurrence for pretty much most of this season. But look at the ability now for Sydney. They're competing in the contest. They're starting to win contested possession. They're starting to force opposition teams into rushed handballs, into rushed turnovers. So look at that. We've got Hayward putting pressure on. We've got Heaney putting pressure on. We're not allowing the opposition to exit their D50 with any sort of conviction, with any sort of pace. And now we have players like Papley who are able to put that sort of pressure. And look at them getting around each other, saying, this is what we're good at. This is what made us so good last year. Let's force the opposition to not have a clean possession ever. And again here, we're just contrasting from that Gold Coast game where they just allowed so many players to run straight through them at stoppage. But we see Hayward miss the football here, but then it's the fight back. And then look, this is a 4v1 just around this contest. But look at how quickly Sydney are to collapse and put pressure on this handball right here. So bang. So now we've got row bottom tackling, and he's forced to put out a little squirt handball to Luke Ryan. And now he's under pressure, and he's the one that has to just bomb the football high and long. And what this does is it allows your defense to compete. It allows your defense to be in a situation, in the position where they can compete. Or, like we see here with Mills, to take an intercept mark. And this is where the defensive system has changed for Dean Cox. We're starting to see their defense actually be able to compete. And a lot of that defensive change and a lot of their team changes just come from their ability to compete in the contest. We saw at the start of the season that they will rank down towards the bottom of the league in allowing teams to have contested possessions and uncontested possessions. In the last 5 weeks alone, they're now ranked in the top 5 for both of those stats. And based on the numbers, but also based on the vision, we're starting to see that they're making it hard for teams to get any clean possession, either in the contest or on the outside of the contest. And when you can stop that, you allow your defense to be set in really good positions. You allow your defense actual time to compete. And when I talk about just allowing your defense to compete, because we understand that Sydney don't have superstars at either end of the ground. Going forward, if you can get the ball use right, like they got last year and like they're starting to get at the back end of this season, you can make those forwards really, really valuable. And it's the same on the defensive end. If you can put enough pressure around the midfield, if you can restrict your opponent's ability to get uncontested possessions around the ground and through stoppage and force them into kicks like this where they're just hacking it on the boot, this is what it allows. Suddenly you don't need to have superstars as key backs because your defenders are now in a position to compete where they're not getting burnt on the lead, they're not getting beaten with really good ball use up the ground. And then this is all you're asking from your defense right now. Just put some pressure on, compete, either get a stoppage or like Hamling does here, get a free kick. And that just comes from the ability for the midfields to put enough pressure on to not allow any really clean ball use out of the stoppage. And that is what allows your defense to be able to just compete. So Sydney have really taken a deep review into their defensive structure and their defensive profile. And we're starting to see the rewards of that. And they are now becoming a dangerous team going into the back end of the season. Now, can they make finals? Well, technically, yes, they can make finals. But they're going to need to go on an almighty run. They might win their next 4, but after that, it gets pretty tough towards the back end of the season. But like we saw on the weekend where they beat Fremantle, they are going to play some teams that are going to have to beat them, and they are going to be a really tough out, especially towards the back end of the season, because we're starting to see their profile change, and their profile is starting to become good. But as usual, if you like these sort of breakdown videos on tactics, teams, play styles, games, whatever you want to see, let me know down in the comments. Also, feel free to subscribe, stick around, and I will see you tomorrow. Cheers.